When a serial killer is captured, there's an elite band of experts called upon by the police to help interview the deadliest category of murderer. Psychologists, psychiatrists and profilers, they are men and women who have spent their entire working lives face to face with some of the most dangerous killers the world has ever known.
Too many similarities for the question not to be asked and for you not to say why.
No comment.
No comment.
They paint the image that I was this monster who picked up like these altar boys along the street and swatted them like flies. I said, this is ludicrous.
I am sorry for all the pain that my actions have caused. I am prepared to die if you say it is necessary.
After working for decades intimately with the most violent people alive, our experts have developed the skills to protect themselves.
If you don't distance yourself, it will get to you over time.
I do not want some of the stuff going through their minds to be running around inside mine.
Every time that you are called upon to do it, you have to take a deep breath and you have to go back into that darkness.
Now, for the first time, these experts have come together to see if there are any common factors in the lives of serial killers that have pushed seemingly ordinary men and women to commit this most heinous of crimes.
I don't believe anyone is born a serial killer.
We need to know the motivation and what they're getting out of it.
What's feeding their fetishes?
Lack of love, lack of family bonding, lack of affection, punishment.
Could these combined factors reach a breaking point that could push the individual over the edge and help us understand what it takes to make a monster?
Serial killing is the malign waste product of a dysfunctional culture.
In December 1978, the Chicago Police Department made a shocking discovery. They had uncovered a homemade cemetery beneath a house in the suburb of Norwood Park. The bodies of dozens of murdered young men were all stacked up neatly in a row. The house belonged to respected Chicago builder John Wayne Gacy. On being arrested, Gacy just laughed, yet he was about to go down in history as one of the worst serial killers the world has ever known. Following his arrest, Gacy was charged with the murder of 33 young men. His defense team requested that he be assessed by a psychiatrist, and that job fell to Dr. Richard Rappaport. It was up to him to try and understand what had turned this seemingly incongruous, jovial man into a monster. Dr. Rappaport would eventually complete a full psychiatric assessment of Gacy. That document, seen here for the first time, is considered to be one of the most important psychological evaluations of a serial killer ever recorded. Dr. Rappaport is now breaking a nearly 30-year silence to discuss his most infamous patient.
I saw him for a total of 65 hours over a period of 5 months, and we got along fine. We never had any angry sessions, no violence. He was never threatening to me. He would sometimes joke, sometimes he would tell me stories about things that were funny. One time or a couple of times he offered to show me how he killed the guys, and it was always very cordial. He didn't seem to be in any way special or different, except I knew what he did, and for me it was extremely unusual.
Gacy told Dr. Rappaport that he had never considered himself to be a serial killer and was appalled to be given that label.
Whether it's Berkowitz, whether it's Bundy, whether it's Williams, Wayne Williams down in Atlanta, or any of the others, or Charlie Manson. See, I hate that when they put me in the same club with them.
This is the first time Dr. Rappaport has seen any footage of Gacy since he last saw him on death row almost 30 years ago.
Well, I have to say it was amazing to me. I felt like I was with him again. It was so real to me. And I recall better than ever how he was when I saw him, because he spoke just like that. Mostly he was trying to convince me of something. He was trying to present himself as a good person. He was trying to say, you could think of all these negative things about him, you could think of all these negative acts about him, but yet he's telling me it wasn't him that did anything. They got the wrong guy.
Dr. Rappaport remembers Gacy enjoying their sessions, but also viewing them as something of a game.
I think most of his stuff is taunting you. I think he's mostly trying to keep you interested in him and satisfy your curiosity and bring your attention to him, and yet he's not guilty of anything.
During their many meetings, Dr. Rappaport felt Gacy had convinced himself that everything he said was the truth, that he'd come to believe he was innocent, even though the evidence would prove he had murdered 33 young men.
I mean, he's not putting on an act. It looks like an act, it amounts to an act, but it's part of him.
But where had this monster come from? To try and answer that, during their sessions, the doctor would ask Gacy to take him back to his childhood, where he was born, in an upper working-class neighborhood of Chicago. His parents had had him late in life, in March 1942. One psychologist who believes that the secrets to Gacy's evolution as a serial killer lies in his upbringing and childhood is Dr. Eric Cullen. As principal psychologist at Her Majesty's Prison, Wakefield, Dr. Cullen interviewed hundreds of murderers. The case of John Wayne Gacy holds a particular interest for him. He believes Gacy would go on to become in many ways the prototype for the modern American serial killer. And that by going back to the beginning of his life, we can understand the key trigger points of what drove him to commit such heinous crimes.
The starting point of any attempt to understand this man has to begin with his name, John Wayne. His father, who was a soldier who fought in the First World War, who was a car mechanic, who was born and raised in the great American Midwest, named his first son after an American icon.
Ladies and gentlemen, I recently finished a motion picture that was filmed on a far location. Out of doors, close to nature, a man gets a chance to think about his country.
An actor who had dominated America's mentality in terms of films. He was a hero. He was tall, rugged, a man's man. He won the women effortlessly. He was one of the most significant cultural icons of his time. And he was straighter than straight. And his father named John Wayne Gacy after his hero. And John Wayne Gacy was a short, fat, sickly mother's boy. And worse than that, he was a homosexual. But not in America in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. Not in the Midwest. You weren't a homosexual, and you certainly weren't gay. You were a sodomite. His father treated him very badly. His father was an abusive, tyrannical, alcoholic, domineering man, constantly judging Gacy, and Gacy was constantly falling short. You can see this throughout his childhood. And that process means he never had a chance.
And it was the relationship with his father that would come to define and shape Gacy's life.
The crucial thing in his life was the relationship with his father, who was really a monster to him. His father came home usually drunk or about to get drunk, and he would go to work in the basement, and he would make things down there, lots of times with wood, so he's sawing and constructing things. And he wouldn't let John come down to the basement when he was there. If he did come down, he would put him to work, he would give him a job to do, and no matter what he did, his father was critical. And he would berate him and make him feel really terrible. But John wanted to have a relationship with his father so bad he'd inevitably get himself down there again.
Young John was made to feel inadequate and ashamed for not living up to his father's expectations. He would come to associate these feelings of personal failure with the violent beatings he suffered at the hands of his father in the realm of the basement. But although his father was abusive, his mother was, for the best part, loving, although she too would suffer at the hands of the father.
He liked his mother a lot because she was a lot less punitive to him. She was a soft person, and he started to like his mother to the point of taking her underwear and wearing it sometimes. He liked it because it was silky and smooth and soft. And he contrasted that with his relationship with his father, which was hard and punitive.
Professor Paul Britton is one of the country's leading offender profilers. As a psychologist, he thinks Gacy's relationship with his mother is as crucial as that with his father.
It's certainly true that he was taking her silk underwear away from a very early age, an age that would normally be a little too early to have that direct sexual interest. But it seems to have been there. It wasn't behavior that was without recognition that it was in some way not approved of. Because it isn't as though he took the underwear and just kept it in his room and was surprised when somebody said, "You can't do that." He took it and he hid it under the porch. Now, it's not clear whether he then used it for sexual purposes or not, but at that tender age, I suspect not. I think that he would have got the comfort that he wanted from his mum in that. He would be able to imagine, he would be able to feel her, as it were, through the underwear, and that was worth the risk.
Right up until his teenage years, Gacy would suffer physical abuse and humiliation from his father. When he turned 18, Gacy left home in search of work and a life of his own. But given his twisted upbringing, he found it difficult to form new relationships, and instead found comfort in the macabre.
He escaped to Las Vegas, where he got a job in a mortuary. I don't think that was chance. And he actually had a bed in the room adjacent to where they laid out the bodies. And one of the most significant trigger events imaginable, he recounts that he spent the night in this bed and at one point climbed into the coffin with the body of a young dead boy, where he proceeded to embrace and caress this body until he had a strange sensation. Well, that strange sensation, I'm presuming, was a sexual sensation, probably to climax. And that's significant for Gacy because he learned in that moment that the best way for him to realize this developing homosexual drive was in caressing and embracing and having sex, ideally with the body of a young male and ultimately dead victim.
When the bright lights of Vegas dimmed for Gacy, he left his job at the funeral home and traveled north, where he sought work on building sites. He quickly found he was a skilled carpenter and also had a business brain. And within a decade, he had founded his own successful construction business. In 1964, he married fellow Chicagoan Marilyn Myers and took on a family life. On the surface, he seemed the embodiment of respectability and indeed the American dream. But beneath the surface, Gacy was fighting to control his demons.
Gacy, I think, was struggling violently and valiantly to create a heterosexual life, a public life as well for himself, even to the extent of having a wife and 2 children. But he was also at the same time indulging in his private personal horror of having sex, so that he was still having homosexual encounters, one of which he was caught. And this is another very significant trigger experience in his life.
Gacy attempted to seduce a series of young men who worked for him on his construction sites. He would use the lure of money and alcohol to get his way. But one of the boys reported Gacy to the police for rape, and despite his best efforts, in the spring of 1968, Gacy's carefully manufactured facade began to crumble.
He did all he could to get the cases dismissed, right down to the point of engaging another youth to go and beat up one of the boys in an attempt to intimidate the boy into not giving evidence. That came to light. The boy who was engaged to do the beating up told all, and of course those 2 cases were turned into convictions for sodomy.
He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. As an immediate consequence of this public knowledge, his wife divorced him. In prison, he was a model prisoner. He was plausible, he was acquiescent, he engaged in as many of the positive activities as he could, and as a consequence, instead of 10 years, he served 18 months.
Whilst Gacy was in prison on Christmas Day 1969, his father died, and when he was told of his death, Gacy broke down and was absolutely inconsolable. He wanted to have made his father proud of him. Now it was too late. On his release from prison in June 1970, Gacy was once again on the move. With money saved to buy a truck, he was determined to get back into the construction business. By 1972, he had married again and was beginning to prosper once more. He was able to purchase a new home in the fashionable Chicago suburb of Norwood Park. The spacious family property had a small cellar or crawl space beneath it, designed for storage and ventilation. For Gacy, the space would take on a chilling new dimension.
He had taken somebody home, a boy, to his house one time, and he had had sex with him, and that wasn't unusual, but the fact is that he fell asleep, or they both fell asleep, and when the boy woke up in the morning, he came into the room where Gacy was, and he was holding a knife, and Gacy was really infuriated by that, and so he wound up killing him. And that was the first murder. And serial murderers often start out with the first crime being accidental as opposed to planned. And that was probably what could be considered the forerunner of the series of crimes that he did.
What is significant in this, I think, in terms of understanding his degradation, his descent, is that he recounted a mind-numbing orgasm in the killing of this young man. And that's, he said, when he realized that death was the ultimate thrill. And I think this liberated Gacy and took him to the next level of becoming a serial killer.
After his first murder in early 1972, Gacy put the body under the crawl space. Shocked by what had happened, he threw himself into the role of being a pillar of the community and a good father to his 2 stepdaughters, thinking it would be something positive to put his energies into and also deflect from his crime.
I always felt that service to community and community service to others, you know, in my religious background, I felt if you serve other people, it'll come back to serve you.
I don't think people who are serial killers start out thinking that they're going to kill more than one person. And then as they go along, I don't think they anticipate more and more and more. But I do think they plan them after they've stopped for a day or a week or a month, whatever it is, because of the satisfaction to get.
Perhaps the most chilling example of Gacy's double life was his most colourful creation, Pogo the Clown. Gacy would dress up to entertain at parties, to raise money for the children's ward of the local hospital. But his real intentions were far from charitable.
He did tell the FBI, in regard of his working as a clown, that he got a kick out of everybody thinking he was such a nice guy as a clown, when in point of fact he was having ulterior motives, having children bouncing on his knee and stuff like that.
The smile painted on Gacy's face was as fake as his public persona. Dr. Adrian Needs was a principal prison psychologist. He knows firsthand how many killers develop a separate killing persona that they learn to hide from the world behind a mask, just like John Wayne Gacy.
With Gacy, I'm very much reminded of the title of the original book on psychopathy, which is Cleckley's The Mask of Sanity, which was really about how often people with psychopathic characteristics can pass themselves off as really quite normal. But also, I think the term mask has a particular meaning in Gacy's case, in that what stands out is this seemingly rather incongruous dressing up and performing as a clown. And it's interesting that Gacy's clown makeup in itself seems rather disturbing and malevolent. But also, I suppose, a clown as, well, performed by Gacy, it's very much about having a mask. And it seems that in other areas of his life, he, in effect, hid behind a mask as well.
Gacy was by now beginning to feel invincible and that he could get away with anything, including murder. Almost 2 years after his first killing, Gacy would claim his second victim in 1974. But like a number of Gacy's victims, he would never be identified. By the winter of 1976, the crimes were about to escalate beyond anything ever seen in the United States. Like most serial killers, Gacy targeted a very specific and vulnerable group of individuals. In this case, young men, some of whom were runaways or were struggling with their sexuality during an era when it was difficult to be openly gay. Many of these men had been offered jobs on Gacy's construction sites, but his seeming benevolence quickly turned to abuse.
It's certainly the case that Gacy would have, if you like, selected his victim group because they were vulnerable, because they were available. It's the same as other serial killers who target prostitutes, working girls. They are easy to get at. The young people that Gacy took were vulnerable, they were easy to persuade, they were easy to draw into his orbit, they may have previously been abused, so they're easy, relatively low risk to get at.
Gacy developed an MO that began with getting his victims plied with drink and even drugs. Once behind the closed doors of his home, he would quickly make moves to have them completely under his control. He would con them into playing an escapologist trick that he perfected at parties as Pogo the Clown. Offering a pair of handcuffs, he would dare the young man to slip them on as part of a trick, but there was no trick. Now restrained, Gacy could overpower his victims. Between October 1976 and December 1977, Gacy was killing a young man almost every month. His desire to kill was now insatiable, and he was becoming increasingly cruel.
As time went on, certainly it became a very well-worn and generally it seems effective technique. Also, he seems to have had some sense of pride in his technique. According to one account, he really developed quite a well, a sensitivity to the amount of pressure that was necessary when he was strangling his victims. He became aware of the effects in terms of blocking off blood and oxygen to the brain of a certain number of turns, for example, when he was using a tourniquet around somebody's neck, in effect garrotting them.
Gacy belongs to a group of killers, serial killers. It's known as sexual sadists. They're people who usually, a major part of their interaction with their victims is sexual.
He wasn't doing anything that wasn't sexually motivated. It's the gratification derived from having other people helpless and demonstrating in it as many ways as possible that they can't influence outcomes, and that you, as the sadist, can influence the outcome. It is all to do with power and control, and very often it's a reflection of the lack of power and control that they have.
Gacy rendered the boys helpless, which then allowed him to enact all manner of torture on them, including burning them with cigarettes and acid. Dr. Richard Shepherd is one of the UK's leading pathologists and has studied the autopsy findings relating to the injuries inflicted upon Gacy's victims, including acid wounds to the eyes.
If the acid is strong enough, it will actually burn the skin. It will blister and burn the skin. And the same, the eye is very, very sensitive. And it would have been incredibly painful to have acid poured in your eyes if you were conscious of it. It may also be that he simply just didn't want them looking at him. You know, the eyes were following him around. He wanted to stop that.
As well as injuries, toxicology reports performed on the boys found many of them had large quantities of drugs in their bodies, administered by Gacy for differing reasons.
Amphetamines have the opposite effect of Valium. It's a stimulant. It increases people's awareness. So it may well be that in those cases the individual had gone too sleepy and it wasn't fulfilling his fantasies. It wasn't giving him what he wanted. So he needed to bring them back up to being aware so that they would respond in the way he wanted them to respond.
One of the most common traits of a psychopath like Gacy is that they are devoid of any natural feelings. And in order to feel anything, they have to go to extremes. Extremes such as torture and murder. And a pattern was emerging, young men being killed and placed in the basement, something that would take on an even greater meaning as the body count rose.
High primary psychopaths simply don't have feelings of remorse. They don't have those feelings of anxiety. They don't have the same autonomic nervous system activity as we might expect. So the stimulation that they get from these excessively violent killings is their way of feeling some of the things that the rest of us feel more naturally.
If he had been asked to stop, or begged to stop, or they were calling out for their parents or something like that, that would be further evidence of him having control, having power. And it's just that sort of thing that, far from having the desired occurrence of getting him to stop, it would make him continue even more forcefully.
But the pleasure Gacy achieved by killing the young men was surpassed by another reason for wanting them dead.
The boys concerned were everything he would like to have been. Slim, young, attractive, good-looking, all of these. And he wasn't. He was short and fat and was acutely conscious of that and couldn't possibly acknowledge it. So what did he do? He would kill the thing he wanted to be because he couldn't get it himself.
All of our experts are in agreement that there is one factor above all else that dominates Gacy's desire to kill: the complex relationship that he had with his father.
He identified with the aggressor. He identified with his father. So to him, he was like his father. He was going to be like his father, who was the one who was so brutal to him. And he basically was blaming them for being bad people or cheap, sick. What he was doing was he was playing the part of his father, and they were then playing, unaware, but playing the role of himself. So he was killing himself, essentially.
By 1978, Gacy had killed 33 young men. But with so many victims, he'd had to find an effective way to dispose of the bodies that would prevent him from being discovered and allow him to go on killing. Gacy decided that the solution to this problem was close to home. He would adapt the crawl space beneath his house into a makeshift cemetery. But as the bodies started piling up, so the smell began to grow. He passed it off as a sewage problem and even ordered his own workmen down into the space to spread lime in a bid to mask the odour.
His chosen place for deposition was principally to put the boys lined up almost like trophies under the crawl space under his ground floor. There are two possible schools of thought. One is that he saw them as trophies, as, you know, I've had that one, I've had that one, I've had that one, and so on. But the other possibility is necrophilia, and it's not out with the possibility that necrophiles enjoy the putrefaction of the bodies, and indeed the stench that most of us would run for our lives if we had to sniff.
He was pretty ingenious, actually, that he managed to bury that many bodies in such a small space and keep them there for such a long period of time. And he was being very rational, because what he was clearly trying to do was make sure that it wasn't discovered. He was trying to destroy the bodies, destroy any odour that may come from them, and actually really thinking through what he needed to do in order to adapt that space under his house to a cemetery, if you like, which obviously it wasn't designed for, and he managed to do it. And even when people would comment on the slightly odd smell that was coming up from the floorboards, he'd just blame it on damp, and they believed him. He was pretty much untouchable, Gacy, because he had such a respectable guise under which he hid, to the point, you know, it seems ridiculous when you think about it, that, you know, he'd rub shoulders with politicians and so on and so forth. He manipulated his way into positions of authority within the community deliberately, I believe, in order to disguise what he was doing and make it absolutely just unbelievable that he could be capable of this. So he created the absolute perfect guise to conceal what he was doing.
In 1978, the police were called to Gacy's house following reports of screaming and a disturbance. Unbeknown to the authorities, they were the sounds of Gacy killing his last victim. As officers entered his home, they were overwhelmed by the foul stench emanating from beneath the floor. Within hours, the property was swamped with a forensics team who started excavating the basement and making grisly discoveries.
The body begins to decompose partly because of its own internal enzymes, these chemicals that destroy cells, but then there are the bacteria in the body, then there's the invasion of other things like insects, maybe blowflies, and then the maggots, and other forms of things that just will destroy the body and the soft tissues of the body at a pace that's unique for where that body is lying. If bodies are buried deep, as we do in a standard normal burial, there is no smell emanating from them because they are so deep. It's a relatively airless, oxygenless situation, and the bodies will decompose at a relatively slow rate. Gacy's problem, in a sense, was that he stacked them so deep, 5 or 6 deep, and the ones near the surface would have been the ones that the smell was still emanating through the cover.
As they searched beneath the house, nothing could prepare the hardened police officers for the sight that lay before them.
They thought that it was the drains originally, but then when they investigated further, all these corpses were lined up side by side under the crawl space, some 28 of them. But there were another 5 that he chose to just chuck in the nearby river and dispose of them that way.
Gacy returned home to find his house was swarming with police. He was quickly arrested on suspicion of murder. Yet despite the overwhelming evidence, he was still convinced he could get away with it.
When they arrested him, even, the power and the ego was right there at the front. He said, "Do you know who I'm connected with?" And he points to 2 pictures. One is of First Lady, Mrs. Carter. Because he was a Democrat and did some work for the Democrats, he was introduced to her once and had a picture taken. And he said, "I'm going to call these people and you'll be sorry if you do anything to me." This kind of pretentious rubbish. But it gives you the flavour of the man altogether.
He was protesting and had well documented his innocence in the face of irrefutable and overwhelming evidence of his guilt. And he did that because he had to sustain at some level this innocent Gacy. And he had done that, I think, because he was withdrawn in himself into an inner reality that he had to sustain in order not to fragment himself. If he accepted what the world knew of him, he would be debased and humiliated and have failed his father irretrievably.
In this interview, filmed shortly before his execution, Gacy was still denying all knowledge of the mortuary beneath the floorboards that he himself had constructed.
I found it as odd when we bought the house that a house with a crawl space would need a sump pump. But then I learned the first time it rained that this ground gets wet under there, and then the crawl space actually floods up to 1 foot deep in water. And then as it recedes, it puts out a musty odor. There was always a musty odor in that house.
Well, he had to know that he was discovered. I mean, he did know the reality. I don't think that he felt he was part of the reality half of the time. He knew he did what he did. I don't think he was that psychotic that he didn't know it. He pretended that he didn't know it. He acted as if he didn't know it. Not just because he was captured and was in prison, but because it wasn't fathomable, it wasn't tolerable to consider that he had done this horrible thing. I mean, it's a form of denial, rationalization.
Gacy was a sexual sadist of the most extreme kind. But had he been identified as a risk early on and given therapy in 1968 when he first began offending, could it have prevented him from becoming a serial killer?
There isn't a way of dealing with people who are sadists, be they sexual or non-sexual. Yes, you can have victim awareness classes and all of that, but the point is, to the extent you're making the sadist aware of the victim's feelings, you're going to further enhance the likelihood that they're going to continue being sadists because they want to have the full experience of it.
they paint the image that I was this monster who picked up like these altar boys along the street and swatted them like flies. I said, this is ludicrous.
I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that he was a monster. I know we're not allowed to use that sort of parlance, but if somebody can tell me how snuffing out the lives of young men in their early teens 33 times, and brutally, sadistically hurting them, well, if that doesn't make people characterized as monstrous, I don't know what does.
Until the very end, Gacy refused to express any remorse. In fact, he even taunted his victims' families with his black sense of humor.
That one mother that gets on television all the time who thinks I should be given 33 injections, I think she ought to take 33 Valiums and go lay down. She goes on Geraldo show and all these other shows talking about, I think it's Maori, I think is the name, her Marine son. Her Marine son, if her Marine son was so great, what the hell did he run away from home 12 times?
He had a sense of humor, and I thought that was, to me, very humorous. I don't know if he said it to be funny, but it comes out funny. You know, you have a picture of the gauze. He used that to demonstrate to me how he would tie a knot and put the knot around someone's neck. He offered to do it with my tie one time, and I didn't take him up on it. But he was, you know, he was a jokester. He would tell jokes about these things. He denied doing it. He'd tell me stories about things he did when he did some of these killings. And then 5 minutes later, he said, you know, I really didn't do that. You know, it's not me.
Another inescapable part of Gacy's story as a serial killer is the question, if he had not felt forced to repress his sexuality, would he have flourished and found normal, loving relations with the same sex?
If he had really grown up in an era where homosexual interests were not seen as deviant and not stigmatized in such a way as they were when he grew up, he might have been able to adapt more successfully. But also, it seems from an early age, well, he had a very dysfunctional upbringing, and it really seems that he grew up lacking empathy and consideration for others, because certainly from his father he hadn't been shown much empathy. He was used to being berated and physically abused.
When your father wants you to be something, and it means so much to you, and you admire your father, and you respect your father throughout what he did to him. Gacy never raised his hand to his father. He accepted his father's judgment as far as he could. He can't abandon that. He wanted his father's approval. There's something enduring and indestructible in human nature. And he carried that with him, not just to his father's death, but to his own.
If people don't want to know the truth and the honesty of it, if they want to be convinced or brainwashed into what they believe, then fine, then go ahead and kill me. But vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, because you will have executed somebody that didn't commit the crime.
The last time I saw him was in death row. He was still the same. His anxiety level was not there, not evident at any time that I saw him. He never sounded like he was worried. And as far as he was concerned, they would figure it out, I guess, that he didn't do it sometime. And especially, you know, when he said he wouldn't be anxious until they put the needle in, that I think that was true for him. I think he said something once about being the last victim. He'd be buried as the last victim of his father. Yes.
the switch that over, that's the yeah, I'm blown. I was at the West Coast, now I'm in the East Coast. Shawty wanna